Sorry about that, babe.
Having played through Kingsfield twice in the last 6 years and most recently Kingsfield 2, I did something that I normally don't. I continued on with the series immediately. I was so excited for the prospect of Kingsfield 3 that I decided to stay in the Verdite Trilogy and see it through. My playthrough was conducted on DuckStation, but I do own the original game and plan to revisit it on real hardware at some point in the near future. Kingsfield 3 is a first-person action RPG that was developed by FromSoftware and published by ASCII Entertainment North America and was released on the Sony PlayStation in North America on November 20th of 1996. I also wanted to mention real quick that there was a Japanese-only bridge demo called Pilot Style, leading into the events of Kingsfield 3 where you controlled David Silveira. It's been translated and I played through it, I had fun, and if you want to watch it, I'll make sure to link it in the description below. The story. First, I wanted to start off by saying that this is by far the most story-driven and dialogue-heavy of the first 3 Kingsfield entries. For a lore buff, I'm Leon Shore, you could have a King's Field Day. Get it? Yeah, that was terrible. Anyway, I'm only scratching the surface here and there's plenty more to delve into if you wish, but the gist of the story of Kingsfield 3 is as follows. King Jean Alfred Forrester, the hero of the first entry, now the King of Verdite, has succumbed to the evil and darkness that has plagued the lands. Alexander, the hero of the second entry, who was on the search for the Moonlight Sword, unfortunately found it too late to help the king. The Moonlight Sword is now broken, which you see specifically during the pilot-style demo, and things are totally awry. Alexander called upon the Chosen Four and gave powers to them in order to protect the kingdom, and with his last dying breath, he used up all that he had in order to put a seal on the castle to contain the corrupted King Alfred. Now you assume the role of Alfred's son, Lyle, 10 years later, and embark on a quest to fell the baddies and uncover the reasons behind his father's woes. Oh yeah, I guess also restoring the light to the kingdom of Verdite is pretty important too. The graphics. It's apparent to just about anyone with eyeballs that the graphics are improved across the board in Kingsfield 3 compared to the previous 2 entries. Don't get me wrong, the same look and feel is still there. The low poly textures create a foreboding atmosphere that is still unmatched. But those low poly textures are a bit more detailed and convey more of the treacherousness of the lands, the enemies, and the sorrows that befall the NPCs of Verdite. Many of the enemies in Kingsfield 3 appear to be more serious in nature compared to some of the goofier designs of the previous entry. A pretty notable graphical change here. The structure of Kingsfield 3 differs greatly compared to 2, which we'll get more into later, but with that being said, many of the areas in Kingsfield 3 are very distinct due to their graphical makeup, color palette, and so forth. It's really apparent that the team at FromSoftware took a little bit more time amping up the graphics in this entry. Also, it's worth mentioning, littered throughout the game are tons of cutscenes with interesting visuals, and sometimes dialogue that help add to the progression of both the game and the story. Music and sound. The sounds of the game are still pretty Kingsfieldy, if you will, although a bit more refined than they were in 2, where sometimes the sound effects sounded like they were being sent through muffled tin cans, but really that's not what I want to talk about here. And while I can't sit here and say that Kingsfield 3 has a bad soundtrack, I will say that I am a bit underwhelmed. I felt that Kingsfield 2 had one of the best soundtracks that I heard in quite some time, an excellent blend of being catchy, but also feeding into the brooding ambient nature of various areas. While Kingsfield 3's soundtrack is almost double in size in the amount of tracks, sometimes more isn't necessarily better. I find that a lot of the tracks are very forgettable. They don't quite stick with me like the ones from the previous entry. A big example of that are the tracks for the Ancient Battleground, the Garrison Barracks and the Palace of Wind, which you'll spend the majority of the first fourth or third of the game. Sure, they are atmospheric, but I think more or less hearing them back to back, they just don't play off each other well. Especially when you hear the first main track, that of Quist, and it's a total banger reminiscent to the first level track of something like Moon Crystal in the Famicom, just incredibly catchy and atmospheric at the same time. The meh, droning nature of the soundtrack continues on into the Forest of Varde, Relugo, and as much as I liked the area, also in places like Shaddam's Cave. Honestly, the soundtrack doesn't really pick up at all for me until the latter half of the game. I felt like they leaned way too heavily into the atmosphere and they just kind of missed the mark on this entry when it comes to the soundtrack. Now don't get me wrong, the game does have plenty of good tracks. For me, tracks like Quist, The Dwarves' Cave, The Ruin of the High Elves, The Passage of Death, The Royal Cemetery, and Verdite Castle, they all slap. But subjectively, the soundtrack took a step down in this entry. Controls. As you could probably expect, the controls of the game are very Kingsfieldy. It's kind of like a new adjective, huh? Pretty much the same old across the board. Clunky maneuvering in combat. Thankfully, you have the sprint button to speed things up, and you'll be spending a lot of time strafing, attacking, and waiting for your various attack and magic meters to recharge. I didn't notice much of an improvement personally from the previous entry, maybe minimal, slightly smoother, but hey, at least it didn't go backwards. Not much to say here really. Some gamers will obviously be turned off by the controls and the mechanics of the first-person FromSoftware games, and that's fine. They're not for everyone. At this point, the controls are like second nature to me, but objectively, yes, they are clunky. Gameplay and fun factor. Kingsfield 3 features a lot more in the way of gameplay changes. Even if subtle, and yeah, the game itself, though not interconnected like Kingsfield 2, is bigger. So, let's dive into it all. One of the major changes in Kingsfield 3 is that it has become a more linear affair. Kingsfield 2 was more or less a giant labyrinth, which sometimes did frustrate me because I'm terrible with directions in games, but overall I did prefer that style. I mean, heck, my favorite FromSoftware game is Dark Souls, so do the math. This major change in Kingsfield 3 makes the game much more easy to navigate, but it loses a bit of that big brain level design charm. Coupled with that is the amazing Pixies map, which basically serves as a one-stop map shop, mapping out each and every area that you go to. Honestly, this was a much needed addition for morons like myself, not having to combine a bunch of different maps, auto-mapping, it's just pretty sweet. I mentioned previously that the story is much more in-depth than previous entries, and that is heavily aided by the NPCs. They all have way more in-depth and interesting dialogue, including a better dialogue system that allows you to go through seamlessly instead of having to constantly wait through awkward NPC animations like they did in Kingsfield 2. There's also a pretty cool dialogue repository in your menu system where you can go back and check what people have said at any point. A neat little addition. Before I get into this next little bit, I did want to mention that I felt the skeletons in Kingsfield 3 were by far the toughest skeletons in the series to this point, but I felt that Kingsfield 3 is perhaps the most forgiving entry in the series. There are so many save spots. I'm not kidding, some areas they'll have like 3 or 4, which is pretty hard to comprehend. Not only that, but there's really no punishment for death, especially after getting the Icarus key warp items. The combat is a little bit easier overall in my opinion, because the game finally features better hit confirmation, the enemies glow when you hit them, and I did not have to grind at all in this game in order to beat it with relative ease. You can organically make your way through, loot, and be ready for all that it throws at you. Sure, I died a couple times, that's always gonna happen, but in general, the difficulty's not really that bad. Much like the soundtrack, I found that a lot of areas in Kingsfield 3 left something to be desired. Sure, the design of them was still decent as far as how you get around, numerous locked chests that could sometimes inspire backtracking, there's still many secrets, etc., but the areas themselves were a bit drab, uninteresting, and sometimes they overstayed their welcome. With that being said, I wanted to shout out a few areas that got my blood flowing in a good way. The first being Shaddam's Cave and the Giant Shrine. This was probably my favorite area of the entire game. It felt very Kingsfield-like in the way that it was put together. Cool atmosphere, interconnected design, fun enemies, and a nice lore dump at the end. That was the shining jewel for me by far, and it was a much needed pick-me-up, especially after the rather ho-hum areas that preceded it. I also very much enjoyed the Ruin of the High Elves for the general fear of the atmosphere, and of course the Royal Cemetery had me popping off, giving that awesome throwback feeling to the first Japanese-only Kingsfield entry. And I felt like Verdite Castle was an interesting exploration, though as mentioned, you are pretty locked, stocked, leveled, and loaded by then, so you don't really need to explore everything, but you felt the urge to do so because it was fun. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the bosses at the end of the game are actually pretty tough. Kingsfield 3 to me shined much brighter around the midway point and beyond, with the exception of Quist, which I felt was a really good starting point for the game. At this point I covered my main likes and dislikes, but I do have some leftovers for you. Here's some more things that I liked. The X-Selector, a sword which you get at the beginning of the game and it grows when you grow? Yeah, it's pretty weird but a cool concept, and honestly the sword itself was great, especially as it got better. I also really enjoyed a lot of the enemy designs in this game compared to Kingsfield 2. Some that stuck out to me are the Alchemine and the Raymire, the former of which is very reminiscent of Quelaag and Chaos creatures from Dark Souls. Oddly enough, the first area that you find them in Kingsfield 3 is the Path of Poison. Whitetown inspiration, anyone? Also, what the heck are these things? Talk about creepy. These actually really unsettled me at the end of the game. Kingsfield 3 has a very high fantasy feel. In many ways, it reminded me of Dark Souls 2, which despite its flack online is one of my favorite FromSoft entries. Many different areas put together in an interestingly connected way, and I felt like many of these areas provided good changes of pace in order to keep you interested along the way. I mean, look at the general variety here. You have a forest area, an icy area, an earthy area, a water area, and so forth. I also want to stress here, don't take my critiques too seriously. I did like the game. It was not bad by any means. I'm just being my normal critical self in my coverage and comparing it to an entry in 2 that I feel was one of the finer games on the console. And speaking of that, some things that I didn't like. The Icarus key warps. the main way of fast travel in Kingsfield 3. It first starts off as 3 different keys, eventually evolving into one that allows you to warp to even more areas. While I am a fan of not having to backtrack anywhere, especially with this game being bigger, I much prefer the warping system in that of Kingsfield 2 with the keys and gates. That system allows you to have up to 3 warps set into whatever guideposts you want. This helps give a much more strategic angle to the warping system, putting more weight on where you place your warps. I also did not like the magic system in Kingsfield 3 basically at all. To me it was kinda just odd. To start the game, magic is terrible. It's weak and takes forever to reload your magic bar. Things don't really get better until you get to the Palace of Wind, where you can basically learn and stack up wind magic, making it a viable option for both attacking and comboing enemies. The magic crystals that you find throughout the game basically buff your elemental magic stats, and the more stats you gain and magic usage, the more your magic power grows, and over time you continue to learn new spells. This is another area where I preferred the magic system in Kingsfield 2, which revolved around consuming the crystals to learn new spells, and simply leveling up these spells through use and consuming Verdite pieces. Coupled with that was sword magic. I just straight up didn't get it in this game. I guess from reading I got the level 1 magic from Veyrak at some point without really realizing what he did, and I'm fairly certain that I missed level 2 sword magic altogether. Thus, I didn't use any sword magic in this game. Now I'm not going to sit here and say that sword magic has been incredibly intuitive across the previous entries, but heck, at least I used some in both those games. I guess for me the bright side is I beat the game without using any, so I guess it's not that important. In general, I just didn't enjoy the magic system in this game. Conclusion. Kingsfield 3 is a good game. It's a fitting end to the Verdite trilogy, and in some ways is a proper advancement of the series, while in others I feel that it stays stagnant or even took a step backwards. My major gripe with Kingsfield 3 is the less interconnected feel compared to that of 2, and in some ways it feels a bit more bloated. It probably could have been trimmed down a bit. That being said, I give Kingsfield 3 on the PlayStation a 7.75 out of 10. While not quite up to par with 2, I think that it clearly is a stronger entry than 1, and by all accounts is still a very solid game with a lot of fun to be had. I'm very excited to finally get to Kingsfield 4, aka the Ancient City, soon enough. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to check out more Kingsfield content, as mentioned, check out the pinned comment, description below, or the end screen here. Take care.